What you're about to see is one of the most unbelievable clashes between law enforcement and the bench ever caught on camera. When a 38-year-old police officer stepped into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom, his confidence quickly turned into catastrophe. Believing his badge gave him authority over the law itself, he challenged the judge and sealed his own fate. What followed ended his career, shattered his pride, and became one of the most talked about lessons in respect, humility, and the true meaning of justice. This is what happens when a badge meets a gavel, and experience reminds arrogance who truly upholds the law. When someone mistakes their uniform for unlimited authority, and when a law enforcement officer discovers that knowing how to enforce the law and knowing how to interpret the law are two very different things. But before we dive into this incredible legal showdown, please hit that subscribe button because this story about professional boundaries and the consequences of challenging judicial authority deserves to reach everyone who needs to understand that respect for the legal system goes both ways. It's a busy Wednesday morning in Providence Municipal Court, and Judge Frank Caprio is handling his usual docket of traffic violations and municipal infractions. The early spring air carries the promise of warmer days, but inside the courtroom, the atmosphere is about to become very heated indeed. At exactly 10:45 a.m., the courtroom doors open with unusual authority, and in strides Officer Derek Thompson, a 38-year-old police sergeant with the Providence Police Department. Thompson moves with the swagger of someone who believes his badge grants him special privileges in every situation. His uniform is pressed to perfection. His boots shine like mirrors, and his entire demeanor radiates the kind of superiority complex that comes from years of being the authority figure in every encounter. Officer Thompson is here because 3 weeks ago, he received a citation for parking in a handicapped space while off duty. The violation occurred outside Tony's restaurant, where Thompson had stopped for lunch while driving his personal vehicle. The fine is standard mids $300 plus court costs. But Thompson isn't here to pay anything. He's here because he believes his law enforcement status should exempt him from what he considers civilian parking regulations. What Thompson doesn't realize is that he's about to challenge a judge who has been interpreting and applying the law since before Thompson was old enough to drive, let alone wear a badge. As Thompson approaches the defendant's stand, his body language immediately establishes a confrontational tone. He doesn't remove his police cap, doesn't stand at attention, and keeps his badge prominently displayed as if to remind everyone in the courtroom of his law enforcement status. Officer Derek Thompson, the court clerk announces, reading from the docket. Thompson steps forward with obvious impatience, his hand resting on his duty belt in a gesture that's more intimidating than respectful. Judge Caprio looks up from his paperwork with the experienced eye of
someone who has dealt with every type of defendant imaginable, including law enforcement officers who think their badges make them above civilian law. Officer Thompson. Judge Caprio begins, his voice carrying the measured authority of 35 years on the bench. You're charged with parking in a handicap space while off duty in violation of City Ordinance 127. The violation occurred on March 15th at 1:30 p.m. outside Tony's restaurant. How do you plead? Thompson's response immediately signals that this case will be unlike anything the courtroom has seen before. Your Honor, Thompson says, his voice carrying the tone of someone who believes he's explaining something obvious to a child, I'm pleading not guilty because this citation represents a fundamental misapplication of parking enforcement policies as they relate to sworn law enforcement personnel. Judge Caprio sets down his pen. Never a positive sign for defendants who think they can lecture him about the law. Officer Thompson, were you on duty at the time of the violation? No, Your Honor, but as a sworn police officer, I maintain certain responsibilities and authorities that require flexible interpretation of civilian parking restrictions. The courtroom becomes very quiet. Thompson has just suggested that his police status gives him the right to ignore laws that apply to everyone else, even when he's off duty. Officer Thompson, were you responding to an emergency or conducting official police business? Thompson's irritation becomes visible. Not at that specific moment, Your Honor, but law enforcement officers must be ready
To respond to situations that civilians cannot handle. This requires certain operational flexibilities. Judge Caprio's expression doesn't change, but veteran court watchers recognize the signs of a judge who is about to deliver a legal education. Officer Thompson, can you cite the specific statute or regulation that exempts off-duty police officers from handicapped parking requirements? Thompson pauses, clearly not having expected to be challenged on legal specifics. Your Honor, with all due respect, police operational protocols supersede municipal parking ordinances. Any experienced law enforcement professional would understand this. The silence that follows is deafening. Thompson has just condescendingly suggested that Judge Caprio lacks understanding of law enforcement operations and legal hierarchies. But Thompson isn't finished making the biggest mistake of his career. Your Honor, Thompson continues, his voice taking on an openly disrespectful tone, I've been enforcing these laws on the street for 15 years. I think I have a better understanding of how they're supposed to work in practice than someone who only sees them from behind a bench. The courtroom erupts in shocked murmurs. Thompson has just insulted Judge Caprio's understanding of the law and suggested that street-level enforcement experience is superior to judicial expertise. What Judge Caprio does next will systematically destroy Thompson's arrogance and potentially end his law enforcement career forever. Judge Caprio slowly removes his glasses, the gesture that signals something significant is about to happen. He sets them down with deliberate precision and looks directly at Thompson with the calm, measured expression that has made him both respected and feared. Officer Thompson, Judge Caprio says, his voice remaining perfectly controlled. I want to make sure I understand your position correctly. Are you arguing that your 15 years of police experience give you greater authority to interpret the law than this court? Thompson, emboldened by what he mistakes for uncertainty, doubles down on his disrespect. Your Honor, I'm simply stating that practical law enforcement requires understanding legal applications that might not be apparent from a purely academic or theoretical perspective. Judge Caprio nods slowly, as if carefully considering Thompson's words. I see. Officer Thompson, since you've questioned this court's understanding of law enforcement and legal interpretation, let me ask you some questions about your case. The judge opens a thick file that had been sitting on his desk. Officer Thompson, you mentioned 15 years of police experience. Can you tell me your current rank and assignment? Thompson straightens his shoulders proudly. Sergeant, Your Honor. Traffic Division Supervisor. Traffic Division? So you supervise the enforcement of traffic and parking violations? Yes, Your Honor, among other duties. Officer Thompson, in your supervisory role, how do you instruct your officers to handle off-duty police personnel who violate parking laws? Thompson hesitates, sensing he's walking into a trap. Your Honor, we handle each situation based on its specific circumstances. That's not what I ask, Sergeant. Do you tell your officers that off-duty police personnel are exempt from handicapped parking laws? Thompson's confident demeanor begins to crack.
Your Honor, there are operational considerations, yes or no, Sergeant Thompson. Do you instruct your officers that police badges exempt people from handicapped parking laws when they're off duty? No, Your Honor, but no, you don't, because there is no such exemption in Rhode Island law. Is there, Sergeant? The arrogance starts draining from Thompson's face as he realizes he's being systematically dismantled by someone who knows the law far better than he does. Your Honor, I believe officer discretion. Sergeant Thompson. Judge Caprio interrupts, his voice gaining authority. You're not a patrol officer exercising discretion. You're a defendant in my courtroom, arguing that you're above the law. There's a significant difference. But Judge Caprio is just getting started. What he reveals next will completely destroy Thompson's case and expose the depth of his professional incompetence. Judge Caprio pulls out another document from his file. Sergeant Thompson, since you've questioned this court's understanding of law enforcement, I took the liberty of reviewing your professional record and your department's policies. Thompson's face goes pale. He clearly hadn't expected his police record to be scrutinized. According to the Providence Police Department Manual, Section 4.2.3, off-duty officers are explicitly required to follow all civilian laws and regulations. Were you aware of this policy, Sergeant? The courtroom is completely silent as Thompson realizes the scope of his legal and professional miscalculation. Your Honor, yes, but furthermore, Sergeant Thompson, according to your internal affairs file, you've received 2 previous reprimands for what your supervisors termed abuse of authority and unprofessional conduct towards civilians. Does that sound familiar? Thompson tries to speak, but Judge Caprio continues with devastating precision. One of these reprimands specifically mentions your belief that police status exempts you from rules that apply to other citizens and your disrespectful attitude toward legal authority. The Internal Affairs Report recommends additional training in professional boundaries and legal compliance. Thompson's arrogance has completely evaporated, replaced by genuine fear as he realizes his career is under direct attack. Your Honor, I don't see how my personnel file relates to a parking violation. Oh, but it relates perfectly, Sergeant Thompson. You see, you've demonstrated in my courtroom the exact same abuse of authority and disrespect for legal systems that has already gotten you in trouble with your own department. Judge Caprio's voice grows stronger, more authoritative. You questioned my understanding of the law based on your 15 years of experience. You suggested that your badge gives you special privileges. You showed the same superiority complex that has already damaged your professional record. What Judge Caprio announces next will shock everyone and potentially destroy Thompson's law enforcement career. Sergeant Thompson, not only am I finding you guilty of the handicapped parking violation and imposing the full $300 fine plus court costs, but I'm also finding you in contempt of court for your disrespectful conduct and abuse of your official position. Thompson's mouth opens in shock, but Judge Caprio isn't finished. Furthermore, Sergeant Thompson, I'm directing court administration to forward a complete transcript of today's proceedings to the Providence Police Department Internal Affairs Division, along with my judicial recommendation that you receive additional training in legal compliance and professional conduct. The courtroom buzzes with shock as Thompson realizes the implications. But, more importantly, Judge Caprio continues, standing up to deliver his final blow,
I'm recommending that the police department review your fitness for supervisory duties. Given your fundamental misunderstanding of legal authority and your documented pattern of believing that your badge exempts you from the rules that govern everyone else. Thompson looks like he's about to collapse as the full weight of his career suicide becomes apparent. Your Honor, you can't destroy my career over a parking ticket. Sergeant Thompson, I'm not destroying your career. You destroyed your career the moment you decided to argue with a sitting judge about the law while demonstrating fundamental ignorance of both legal principles and your own department's policies. Judge Caprio walks closer to the defendant's stand, his full judicial authority on display. Sergeant Thompson, let me share something with you about legal authority and professional respect. I've been practicing law for 45 years. I've been on this bench for 35 years. I've handled over 400,000 cases, including criminal cases involving police officers, internal affairs investigations, and disciplinary hearings for law enforcement personnel. The judge's voice takes on the tone of a disappointed commander addressing a failed officer. In all those years, I've learned that the most dangerous law enforcement officers are those who believe their badge makes them above the law, above accountability, and above the very legal system they've sworn to serve and protect. Thompson stands frozen, his earlier swagger completely destroyed. You walked into my courtroom today thinking you could intimidate a judge with your badge and your 15 years of experience? Instead, you've demonstrated exactly why your own department has repeatedly disciplined you for abuse of authority. Judge Caprio returns to his bench, preparing to deliver his final judgment. A police officer who shows disrespect for judicial authority is the same officer who shows disrespect for constitutional rights. A sergeant who thinks parking laws don't apply to him is the same sergeant who thinks other laws are suggestions rather than requirements. The judge picks up his gavel. Sergeant Thompson, your $300 fine is now $800 with court costs. Your contempt citation carries an additional $500 penalty. But most importantly, you'll be explaining to Internal Affairs why a sitting judge has serious concerns about your understanding of legal authority and professional boundaries. Thompson's voice is barely a whisper. Your Honor, please. I'm not finished, Sergeant. You mentioned that 15 years of street experience gives you better understanding of the law than judicial interpretation. Let me tell you what I understand. After 35 years of applying the law, respect for legal authority isn't optional. Professional humility isn't weakness. And no badge, no matter how shiny, exempts anyone from basic accountability. The judge looks out at the audience.
The packed courtroom, including several other police officers who had come to watch their colleagues' hearing. Let this be a lesson to every law enforcement officer watching. Your badge is a symbol of service, not supremacy. Your oath is to protect and serve, not to exempt yourself from the laws you've sworn to uphold. Your authority comes from the people and the Constitution, not from your uniform. He looks back at Thompson, who stands with his head bowed in complete humiliation. Sergeant Thompson, I strongly recommend that you spend some time reflecting on why respect for the legal system and humility in the face of lawful authority are not optional for law enforcement officers. The badge doesn't make you above the law, it makes you more accountable to it. Judge Caprio raises his gavel. Court is adjourned. The gavel comes down with finality. But the story doesn't end there. What happened in the following weeks would prove exactly why challenging judicial authority always leads to professional destruction. As the courtroom emptied, Thompson stood alone at the defendant table, staring down at the citation that had just cost him $1,300 and potentially his supervisory position.
The superiority complex that had carried him through 15 years of police work had been systematically dismantled by a 76-year-old judge who never raised his voice. Captain Maria Rodriguez, Thompson's commanding officer, had been in the gallery watching the entire proceeding. She approached Thompson as he gathered his belongings, her expression a mixture of disappointment and professional concern. "Sergeant Thompson," she said quietly, "I watched the entire hearing. That judge just demonstrated the kind of professional respect and legal knowledge that you've consistently failed to show in your supervisory role." Thompson looked up at her, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "Captain, I didn't mean for it to escalate." "Derek, this is exactly what I have been trying to address in your performance reviews. Your belief that the badge makes you special, your disrespect for civilian authority, your fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to serve and protect." As Thompson walked out of the courthouse, local news reporters who had witnessed his humiliation followed him with cameras. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues who had watched the live stream. The video of his legal destruction would be viewed over 2 million times in the first 24 hours. Law enforcement blogs analyzed Judge Caprio's systematic dismantling of Thompson's arrogance as a perfect example of judicial authority properly checking police misconduct. Police academies began using the exchange as a training tool about the importance of humility and legal compliance in law enforcement. But the real impact was felt within the Providence Police Department. Within days, Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation into Thompson's fitness for supervisory duties. The department's review, combined with Judge Caprio's judicial recommendation, led to Thompson's removal from supervisory responsibilities and mandatory retraining in constitutional law and professional conduct. 3 weeks later, Thompson was summoned to appear before the police department's disciplinary board.
Of his courtroom behavior, combined with his previous reprimands, painted a picture of an officer whose arrogance posed a genuine threat to public trust and departmental integrity. The board's decision was swift and decisive. Thompson was demoted from sergeant to patrol officer, placed on probationary status for 1 year, and required to complete 40 hours of continuing education in constitutional law, professional ethics, and civilian relations. Officer Thompson's return to the courthouse 6 months later was a study in transformation. Gone was the arrogant sergeant who had challenged Judge Caprio's authority. In his place stood a humbled patrol officer who had learned that respect for the legal system wasn't just professional courtesy, it was the foundation of legitimate law enforcement. "Your Honor," Thompson said, standing before Judge Caprio with genuine remorse, "I want to formally apologize for my conduct 6 months ago. I was arrogant, disrespectful, and completely out of line. The consequences of my behavior have taught me that wearing a badge means serving the law, not being above it." Judge Caprio nodded approvingly. "Officer Thompson, apology accepted. What you've learned about respect and humility will make you a better police officer and a better servant of the public." The transformation of Derek Thompson became a case study in Rhode Island law enforcement circles. He eventually completed his probationary period and earned back his colleagues' respect through consistent demonstration of professional humility and strict adherence to legal protocols. Years later, Thompson would tell police academy recruits, "Judge Caprio didn't end my career to humiliate me. He humbled me to save my career and protect the integrity of law enforcement. He taught me that the badge doesn't grant privileges. It creates responsibilities, and the most important responsibility is respecting the legal system we've sworn to serve." The video of that Wednesday morning became one of the most watched law enforcement accountability moments ever recorded, shared millions of times across social media platforms. Police departments around the world used it as training material about the importance of professional boundaries and respect for judicial authority.
But for those who knew Judge Caprio personally, it was simply another example of what made him special. He showed the rare ability to discipline with dignity, to educate through justice, and to turn arrogance into accountability without ever raising his voice. Judge Frank Caprio reminded the world that true authority isn't measured by power or position, but by wisdom, preparation, and an unshakable respect for the law. At a time when trust between law enforcement and the public often feels fragile, he proved that accountability protects everyone, officers, courts, and citizens alike. Through calm strength and fairness, Judge Caprio reminded us that respect for the law begins with those who uphold it, even when they think no one is watching. And to everyone watching, if you believe in justice with humanity and judges who restore faith and fairness, hit subscribe and stay with us here on Case Closed, where every story reminds us that real power is earned, not imposed.